Good evening, my dear friends. I'm Jake Walker, and this is the newest story on my channel.
A German shepherd stood beside an abandoned wooden bridge in the Wyoming snow, waiting for a man who would never come back. For 4 nights, Ethan Cole saw the old dog there, beneath the freezing wind. When the temperature dropped below -30, the shepherd collapsed beside a worn backpack containing a rusted key, a faded photograph, and a dying man's final note. Winter settled over Jackson Hollow like an old hymn, too tired to end. Snow covered the roofs of the little Wyoming town in thick white silence, softening the fences, swallowing tire tracks, and turning the frozen lake beside Ethan Cole's cabin into a sheet of dull silver beneath the clouds. The wind moved slowly through the pine trees that night, carrying the dry whisper of distant snow across the hills. Ethan had lived long enough to know that winter in Wyoming did not always arrive like violence. Sometimes it arrived politely, quietly burying things people were not ready to lose. Ethan Cole was 58 years old, broad-shouldered, 6 feet tall, with the kind of heavy frame built by military discipline, and years of carrying equipment across places most men only saw on television. His jaw was square and rough with grey stubble because he had stopped caring about shaving every day after his wife died. Dune. Deep lines sat beside his eyes, not from smiling often, but from years of staring into desert sunlight and snow glare alike. His dark hair had faded into iron grey around the temples, cut short out of habit from his years in the United States Navy SEALs. Even in retirement, he moved carefully, quietly, like a man trained to notice danger before it noticed him. 3 years earlier, cancer had taken his wife, Laura, slowly enough to destroy him in pieces. Ethan had survived ambushes overseas, freezing water training, and nights filled with gunfire. Yet none of it had prepared him for the helplessness of watching Laura become smaller each week in a hospital bed, while machines breathed louder than she did. He still blamed himself for missing her final hour, because he had stepped outside the hospital to answer a meaningless phone call from an insurance office. Ever since then, guilt had settled inside him, like another organ. He carried it everywhere. That evening, Ethan drove his old Ford pickup through the narrow road outside town after delivering supplies for the church pantry. The heater rattled weakly beside him, while country music whispered low through the speakers. Jackson Hollow had become quieter over the years. Young people moved away. Stores closed earlier. Windows stayed dark longer. Only the older residents remained, moving slowly through life like survivors of some invisible storm. Near the edge of town stood an old wooden bridge crossing Blackwater Creek. The bridge had once carried logging trucks decades ago, before the new highway bypassed it. Now it remained mostly abandoned except for fishermen in summer and teenagers daring each other to cross it at night. Ethan slowed the truck automatically as his headlights swept across the bridge. That was when he saw the dog again. A German shepherd stood near the railing beneath the falling snow, unmoving against the wind. The animal was large, though age had thinned him. His black and tan coat looked rough, with frost gathered along the fur of his chest and back. One ear stood upright while the other leaned slightly sideways, torn near the edge long ago. Around his neck hung a worn leather collar darkened by weather and time. The dog looked down the empty road beyond the bridge instead of at the truck, as if waiting for headlights that would never arrive. Ethan stopped the pickup. For 3 nights he had seen the same dog standing there. The first night he assumed someone nearby owned him. The second night unsettled him. By the third, the temperature had dropped below -30, and no living creature belonged outside alone. Ethan stepped out into the cold. Snow crunched beneath his boots, while the wind bit through his heavy coat. The German shepherd finally turned his head slightly toward him. His amber eyes looked exhausted but alert, carrying the strange dignity old dogs sometimes had, the kind earned only through years of loyalty. Ethan had seen military dogs overseas with those same eyes after explosions and firefights. "Hey there." Ethan said softly. His voice sounded rough from disuse. The dog did not bark or growl. He simply watched. Ethan noticed the animal's ribs beneath the fur and the faint trembling in his legs. Nearby sat a faded green backpack half buried in snow. Ethan crouched slowly, every instinct careful not to threaten the animal. The German shepherd took one backward step, but did not run. Ethan opened the backpack carefully. Inside rested a folded blanket, a rusted thermos, an old photograph, and a small envelope sealed inside plastic. The photograph showed an elderly man standing beside the same dog during warmer weather. The man looked thin but cheerful, wrapped in an oversized denim jacket and wool hat. His beard was white and uneven, his face weathered by hardship yet oddly gentle. On the back of the photograph, someone had written the name Walter Hayes in faded blue ink. Ethan opened the envelope. The handwriting inside shook badly across the paper. "If I do not come back, please do not let Duke stay alone. He waits even when he should not." Ethan read the sentence twice. Something tightened painfully inside his chest. The dog stood motionless beside him, snow collecting across his back, while the dark road stretched empty behind him. Ethan understood, waiting. Some men waited for war to leave their heads. Some waited for forgiveness. Some waited so long for someone they loved that waiting itself became their final home. The German shepherd lowered himself slowly into the snow beside the backpack, exhausted beyond pride. Ethan noticed frost clinging to the dog's whiskers and ice trapped between the cracked pads of his paws. Anger rose quietly in him then, not toward the animal, but toward the coldness of the world that left old creatures standing alone beside forgotten roads. Back in Jackson Hollow, Mary Dawson was locking the front door of her bakery when Ethan's truck passed the town square. Mary was 67, short and slightly heavy-set, with soft silver hair curled neatly beneath a knitted cap. Her cheeks stayed pink from years beside warm ovens, and her pale blue eyes carried the calm patience of someone who had spent a lifetime feeding lonely people without asking questions. She had been widowed nearly 10 years earlier after her husband suffered a heart attack during a fishing trip. Since then, she treated half the town like stubborn grandchildren. She often tried speaking to Ethan whenever he visited her bakery for coffee, but Ethan always kept conversations brief. Mary watched the truck disappear toward the lake road and sighed softly. "That man's loneliness walks into a room before he does," she murmured to herself. Ethan drove back toward the bridge, one final time, after passing town. Snow thickened across the windshield. The bridge appeared again beneath the headlights, pale and silent against the frozen creek below. The dog still lay there beside the backpack, too weak now even to stand. Ethan shut off the engine. For a long moment, he sat motionless, gripping the steering wheel. Part of him wanted to drive away. Taking care of something living meant risking attachment. Attachment meant loss. Loss meant reopening wounds he spent years trying to freeze shut. But outside, the old German shepherd lifted his head weakly toward the sound of the truck, still waiting despite everything. Ethan exhaled slowly and stepped into the storm. "All right," he muttered. "You're coming home with me." The dog did not resist when Ethan wrapped him carefully in the blanket and lifted him into the truck. He was lighter than he should have been. That bothered Ethan deeply. During the drive back to the cabin, the German shepherd rested silently against the passenger seat with tired amber eyes half closed. Once, as the truck passed through the darkness beside the frozen lake, the dog looked toward Ethan instead of the road. It was not trust yet. It was something quieter. Recognition, perhaps. By the time Ethan carried him inside the cabin, snow covered both man and dog in white powder. The fire crackled low inside the stone fireplace, while warm yellow light filled the room for the first time in months with something resembling life. Ethan laid the dog beside the hearth and placed the faded backpack nearby. Outside, winter continued, swallowing the world in silence. But inside the lonely cabin beside the frozen Wyoming lake, another creature breathed beneath Ethan Cole's roof for the first time since Laura died. Morning arrived over Jackson Hollow, beneath a pale gray sky that looked stretched thin by cold. Snow still covered the lake behind Ethan Cole's cabin, though the wind had calmed during the night and left the world strangely quiet, as if the mountains themselves were listening. Smoke drifted lazily from the stone chimney, while inside the cabin, the fire crackled low beside the sleeping German shepherd. Duke had not moved much since Ethan brought him home. The old dog lay on a folded army blanket near the hearth, with one paw twitching occasionally in uneasy dreams. In daylight, Ethan could finally study him properly. Duke was older than he first thought, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, large-framed but worn down by hunger and weather. Thin silver fur had spread around his muzzle and above his eyes like frost collecting on dark earth. The torn edge of his ear gave him the rough appearance of an old soldier who had survived too many winters to care about scars anymore. Yet, despite exhaustion, the dog carried himself with remarkable discipline. He never barked unnecessarily, never snapped, never begged. Even weak, he watched doors and windows the way trained animals watched exits. Ethan understood that kind of vigilance too well. He stood in the kitchen, pouring coffee into a chipped mug, while Duke slowly lifted his head at the sound of a truck somewhere beyond the lake road. The dog's tired amber eyes immediately fixed on the window. Ethan noticed how his entire body stiffened with desperate hope before slowly relaxing again when the sound faded. Something about that silent disappointment unsettled him more than barking would have. "Nobody's coming, huh?" Ethan muttered quietly. Duke lowered his head back onto his paws without looking away from the door. Ethan spent the morning cleaning the old backpack he had found beside the bridge. Inside were only a few simple belongings, now that the snow had thawed from the fabric. A pair of worn gloves, loose batteries, a small screwdriver set, and several receipts from places around town. Most were months old. One receipt came from Mary Dawson's bakery. Another from a hardware store near the abandoned rail station. Ethan folded the paper carefully. He had not planned on getting involved in another person's unfinished life. But every object inside the backpack carried the stubborn shape of someone who had tried to survive quietly without asking much from the world. Around noon, Ethan loaded Duke carefully into the truck. The dog climbed in slowly, but refused help once his paws touched the floorboard. Pride still lived inside him somewhere, beneath exhaustion. Jackson Hollow's main street looked half asleep beneath the snow. Christmas decorations still hung from several storefronts, even though January had nearly ended. The little bell above Mary Dawson's bakery door rang softly when Ethan entered. Warm air smelling of cinnamon and fresh bread wrapped around him immediately. Duke paused beside the entrance, sniffing carefully before following. Mary looked up from behind the counter and froze for a moment. "Well?" she said softly, pressing one flower-covered hand against her chest. "You actually brought him." Mary Dawson wore a dark green cardigan over a long denim skirt. Practical clothes, softened by years of use. Her silver hair curled gently around her cheeks, and deep lines surrounded her eyes from decades spent smiling at strangers who needed kindness more than conversation. She had the sturdy build of women who survived grief by continuing to feed other people. There was warmth in her face, though sadness lingered beneath it permanently now, like smoke trapped inside old curtains. Duke studied her carefully, but did not growl. Mary crouched slowly, despite her aching knees. "Hey there, sweetheart," she whispered. "You look like winter chewed on you a while." Duke's torn ear twitched once. Ethan ordered coffee, while Mary disappeared briefly into the kitchen and returned with a plate of scrambled eggs and small pieces of turkey. "For him," she said firmly, before Ethan could protest. Duke stared at the food, but did not eat immediately. Instead, he glanced once toward Ethan as though waiting for permission. That small gesture tightened something unexpectedly human inside Ethan's chest. "Go ahead," he said quietly. Only then did Duke begin eating slowly and carefully. Mary watched the dog with moist eyes. "That's Walter's dog," she murmured. Ethan looked up sharply. "You knew him?" Mary nodded and leaned against the counter. Everybody knew Walter Hayes, even if most folks pretended not to. She poured herself coffee and sat across from Ethan. He lived in an old RV near the rail station. Fixed watches, radios, toasters, hearing aids. Anything broken, really. Never charged people much. Ethan listened silently, while Duke continued eating beneath the table. "He wasn't crazy or dangerous," Mary continued. "Just poor. There's a difference people forget once somebody starts sleeping in a vehicle." She smiled sadly into her coffee mug. Walter used to come here every Thursday morning, always ordered one cinnamon roll and cut pieces off for Duke before touching it himself. Ethan glanced down at the dog. Duke had stopped eating again at the sound of another truck outside, his eyes fixed painfully toward the bakery window until the sound disappeared into snow. Mary noticed too. He used to wait outside the clinic when Walter had treatments, she said quietly. 3 hours sometimes, never moved. Ethan folded his arms. "What happened to Walter?" Mary's expression changed. The softness remained, but grief moved underneath it now. Hope Harbor happened. Ethan had heard the name before. A charity organization operating around Wyoming and Idaho, helping homeless veterans and elderly people. Mary stirred her coffee slowly. They said Walter needed better medical care, free treatment, warm bed, transportation. She looked toward the snowy street outside. 2 weeks later, they announced he died from lung disease. Ethan frowned. Nobody questioned it. Mary laughed softly without humor. "Small towns are strange, Ethan. People trust organizations with nice brochures more than lonely old men living in RVs." Silence settled between them briefly. The bakery radio played old country music quietly, while snow drifted outside the windows. Finally, Mary spoke again, more carefully this time. "You know why I keep trying to talk to you?" Ethan looked uncomfortable immediately. Mary smiled faintly. "Because I know survivor eyes when I see them." Ethan stared into his coffee. "You don't know anything about me. My son Daniel died in Iraq in 2007, Mary said gently. Marine Corps. 22 years old. After they brought him home, my husband stopped speaking much. Then, 5 years later, his heart gave out on a fishing boat. She shrugged lightly. Grief changes people different ways. Some cry, some drink. Some build walls and pretend they're cabins. Ethan almost smiled despite himself. Mary noticed and pointed at him immediately. There. See? You still remember how. Ethan looked away quickly, uncomfortable with warmth after so many years hiding from it. When he finally stood to leave, Mary packed extra food for Duke without asking. If you find out anything about Walter, she said quietly near the door, I'd like to know he mattered to somebody. Outside, the snowfall had thickened again. Ethan drove toward the abandoned rail station before returning home. The old RV park sat half buried in snow near rusted train tracks disappearing into the hills. Most vehicles there looked dead already, windows broken, tires flat. But one faded blue RV stood apart somehow. Duke suddenly rose in the truck seat. His breathing changed instantly. Before Ethan even parked, the old dog pressed against the window, trembling with recognition. Easy, Ethan murmured. Duke whined softly for the first time. Not loudly. Just one broken sound. The RV smelled faintly of old metal, dust, and something human long faded. Inside, blankets remained folded neatly beside tiny shelves filled with tools and watch parts. Walter Hayes had tried to keep dignity alive inside this cramped little world. Ethan stood silently while Duke moved slowly through the RV, sniffing corners with painful concentration. Then the dog stopped near the small bed and pawed gently beneath it. Ethan crouched and reached underneath. His fingers touched cold metal. Duke pulled free, an old brass key tied to faded red string. The dog carried it carefully toward Ethan and placed it at his feet without taking his eyes off him. Outside, snow continued falling over the silent rail yard, while somewhere deep inside the old RV, the shape of Walter Hayes still lingered like unfinished prayer. Snow fell lightly over Jackson Hollow the following evening, softer now, almost gentle, as though winter itself had grown tired of anger. The mountains surrounding the town disappeared beneath layers of grey fog, while distant train tracks groaned occasionally from the cold, sounding like old bones shifting beneath frozen earth. Ethan Cole drove slowly toward the salvage yard, beyond the abandoned rail station, with Duke lying awake beside him in the truck. The old German shepherd no longer trembled from exhaustion the way he had days earlier, but he still carried sadness inside his posture, like extra weight across his shoulders. Every few minutes, Duke lifted his head toward the faded brass key resting on the dashboard, watching it with strange concentration. Ethan had cleaned the key earlier that morning. Beneath the rust and scratches, faint letters appeared, carved into the metal. B. 12. He did not know what it opened yet, but he understood enough about desperate men to know that Walter Hayes had hidden it for a reason. The salvage yard sat near the edge of town, where civilization slowly gave up and turned back into wilderness. Rusted vehicles rested beneath snowdrifts, like forgotten animals buried halfway into hibernation. The owner, Gus Harlow, stepped out from a small office trailer carrying a lantern and cigarette. Gus was 72 years old, tall but bent from decades of lifting engines and scrap metal. His beard looked like dirty steel wool beneath the lantern light, and one cloudy eye drifted slightly sideways after a welding accident years earlier. Most people in Jackson Hollow found Gus unpleasant because he spoke bluntly and trusted almost nobody. But Ethan respected men who had been shaped honestly by hardship instead of politeness. "You're Walter's dog man now," Gus muttered before Ethan even spoke. Duke stepped out of the truck slowly beside Ethan, immediately sniffing the frozen air with sharp focus. "I need to see Walter's RV again," Ethan said. Gus studied him quietly, while smoke curled from the cigarette between his cracked fingers. "Folks from Hope Harbor already came through here after Walter died," he said finally. "Cleaned most of it out." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "Most?" Gus shrugged. "They said they were collecting personal effects. Truth is, rich charities hate poor people leaving behind evidence they existed." Ethan followed Gus through rows of frozen wreckage until the faded blue RV appeared again beneath snow and darkness. Duke moved ahead this time without hesitation. The old dog climbed inside immediately, nose working carefully along the floor and walls. Ethan unlocked the RV using the brass key. Near the back corner beside Walter's narrow bed stood a small rusted cabinet built into the wall. The key fit perfectly. Inside rested only old tools, receipts, and worn photographs at first glance. But Duke suddenly pawed hard against the floor beneath the bed again. More urgently now. Ethan knelt and pushed aside the thin mattress. Beneath it he discovered faint scratch marks surrounding a square wooden panel hidden under old carpet. "Well," Gus murmured behind him. "That's interesting." Ethan pried the panel loose carefully, using a screwdriver from Walter's toolbox. Beneath it sat a dented silver tin box wrapped inside an oilcloth blanket. Duke stared at the box intensely, tail still, breathing shallow. Ethan opened it slowly, Inside were stacks of papers bundled with rubber bands, faded photographs, donation forms, handwritten notes, and several envelopes marked with dates. The smell of dust and old paper drifted upward immediately. Ethan began sorting through the contents, while snow tapped softly against the RV windows. At first, the papers looked harmless enough. Lists of food donations, winter shelter reports, names of homeless veterans and elderly residents receiving support from Hope Harbor. But slowly patterns began appearing. Several people listed as currently receiving assistance had obituary notices folded beside their names. Some photographs showed the same individuals appearing months apart, wearing identical clothes, and posing beside Hope Harbor volunteers, despite records suggesting they had already died.
Jesus,
Ethan muttered quietly. One photograph caught his attention. Walter stood beside 3 elderly homeless men outside a warehouse near the rail station. All of them smiled awkwardly beneath a Hope Harbor banner while holding donated blankets. Yet one of the men carried a black funeral ribbon pinned onto his coat. Ethan recognized him instantly. Harold Bennett. He had attended Harold's funeral nearly 6 months earlier at the Veterans Church outside town. That man was dead already, Ethan said. Gus leaned closer, squinting with his good eye. Yep, Harold froze outside Elk Pass last winter. Ethan's stomach tightened painfully. Duke lowered himself beside the tin box and rested his muzzle near Walter's papers, as if guarding them. Outside, the wind shifted through broken rail lines, with low, mournful sounds. Ethan kept reading. More names appeared beside donation records. Missing people, dead people. Individuals supposedly transferred into extended care programs through Hope Harbor, though no actual addresses appeared beside the forms. Someone had circled certain names repeatedly in red ink. Walter's handwriting grew shakier in later pages, as though illness worsened while he wrote. Then Ethan found an envelope containing several photographs, taken secretly from a distance. One showed a warehouse behind the railroad yard, with trucks parked outside, late at night. Another showed volunteers carrying boxes inside, while elderly men waited nearby in wheelchairs beneath snow. On the back, Walter had written only 3 words. They disappear here. Ethan sat very still after reading that. Years of military instincts sharpened quietly, awake inside him again. Not fear, exactly. Recognition. He knew the feeling of hidden patterns beginning to surface beneath ordinary appearances. Duke suddenly lifted his head toward the RV door, with low tension moving through his body. Headlights approached outside slowly. Gus cursed softly under his breath. A black SUV rolled past the salvage rows before stopping near the gate. Ethan watched 2 men step out briefly, look around, then drive away again without speaking. "Hope Harbor volunteers?" Gus muttered darkly. "Been snooping around here all week." Ethan closed the tin box carefully. On the drive back to the cabin, silence filled the truck, except for the soft rattle of papers inside the box, resting between Ethan and Duke. Snowfall thickened again around Jackson Hollow, while yellow lights glowed warmly inside scattered homes. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something stronger than grief moving through him. Purpose. Not clean or noble yet, but alive. When they reached the cabin, Mary Dawson's old station wagon already sat outside beneath fresh snow. Warm light spilled through Ethan's kitchen window. Inside, Mary stood near the stove, placing a fresh apple pie onto the counter, as though she had always belonged there. "You left your door unlocked," she said, without turning around. "That's either trust or laziness." Ethan almost smiled while removing his coat. Duke walked directly toward Mary and leaned tiredly against her leg. "Traitor," Ethan muttered. Mary laughed softly and scratched Duke behind the ears. Then her eyes drifted accidentally toward the hallway. One bedroom door remained slightly open. Through it, Laura Cole's room still waited untouched, exactly as it had 3 years earlier. Her sweater hung beside the closet. Books remained stacked beside the bed. Even perfume bottles still rested on the dresser beneath dust. Mary's expression softened immediately. "Oh, Ethan," she whispered. Ethan froze. Shame moved across his face like a shadow. "I keep meaning to clear it out," he said quietly. "Then don't," Mary answered gently. "Not until you're ready." Silence settled between them, while snow hissed softly against the windows. Ethan stared into the fire for a long moment before speaking again. "Sometimes I think if I change that room..." He swallowed hard. "Then she's really gone." Mary walked closer slowly, her lined face full of quiet understanding instead of pity. "After Daniel died," she said softly, "I kept his muddy boots beside my front door for 2 years. Ethan looked at her. "Why?" Mary smiled sadly. "Because grief makes people do strange things when love has nowhere left to go." Ethan felt his throat tighten painfully. For the first time since Laura's death, he spoke honestly aloud. "I don't think I deserve another happy thing in my life." Mary studied him for a long moment, then reached out and placed one warm hand over his rough knuckles. "That's what surviving does to good people," she whispered. "It convinces them they owe sadness, loyalty." Duke lifted his head from beside the fireplace and looked toward Ethan quietly, as though listening. Later that night, after Mary drove home through the falling snow, Ethan reopened the tin box, alone, beside the fire. He studied the photographs again beneath lamplight until one image finally stopped him cold. Walter Hayes stood beside several Hope Harbor volunteers outside the railroad warehouse. Behind Walter, smiling confidently in a heavy wool coat, stood Mayor Benjamin Carter of Jackson Hollow himself. Ethan stared at the photograph while cold unease slowly spread through his chest. Benjamin Carter was not just another politician. He had built half the town's charity programs. Hope Harbor operated under his public support. And suddenly, Walter Hayes no longer looked like a lonely old man who died forgotten. He looked like someone who had seen something dangerous before winter swallowed him whole. By late January, the snow around Jackson Hollow had hardened into gray ridges along the roads, shaped by plows, wind, and the weight of too many storms arriving one after another. The mornings came slowly now. Sunlight appeared weak and colorless behind the mountains, as though even daylight had grown tired of winter. Ethan Cole stood outside his cabin, tightening the collar of his coat, while Duke watched from the truck, alert but quiet. The photograph of Mayor Benjamin Carter still rested inside Ethan's pocket beside Walter Hayes's papers, and the more he studied it, the heavier the town around him began to feel. Small places carried secrets differently than cities did. In cities, people disappeared into noise. In small towns, they disappeared into silence. Ethan drove toward the oldest part of Jackson Hollow, where the public library sat near the frozen creek. The library itself had nearly closed years earlier after county funding cuts, but one woman had fought to keep it alive, almost by stubbornness, alone. Sarah Miller lived in the small caretaker's cottage behind the building, surrounded by stacks of newspapers, old filing cabinets, and enough forgotten town records to reconstruct half a century of Jackson Hollow's mistakes. Ethan had not spoken to her properly in years. Sarah Miller opened the cottage door before he knocked twice. "You still walk like somebody entering hostile territory," she said, calmly. Sarah was 63 years old, tall and slender, with sharp shoulders beneath a dark wool sweater. Her silver blonde hair remained cut neatly to her jawline, though several strands escaped constantly around her face. Deep freckles spread lightly across pale winter skin, and thin reading glasses rested low on her nose, as if permanently disappointed in humanity. Once, Sarah had been the most respected investigative journalist in northern Wyoming before her husband died in a highway accident 20 years earlier, during a snowstorm, remarkably similar to this winter. Since then she had grown quieter, more guarded, though her eyes still carried the restless intelligence of someone who noticed details other people stepped over. Duke hesitated at the doorway before entering. Sarah immediately noticed him. "Well," she murmured softly. "Walter's old guardian." Duke watched her carefully, then lowered his head slightly, accepting her presence faster than Ethan expected. "He remembers people better than most humans do." Sarah said. Inside the cottage, newspapers covered nearly every surface. Old photographs hung beside shelves, overflowing with files and cassette tapes from interviews decades old. The room smelled faintly of cedar wood, coffee, and old paper. Sarah cleared a chair with one hand while Ethan placed Walter's tin box carefully on the kitchen table. Snow tapped softly against the windows while Duke settled beside the fireplace with tired dignity. Sarah opened the box slowly, adjusting her glasses as she examined the papers one by one. The silence stretched long enough for Ethan to hear the old wall clock ticking beside the shelves. Finally, Sarah exhaled sharply through her nose. "Damn," she whispered. Ethan folded his arms. "You see it too?" Sarah nodded without looking up. "These aren't accounting mistakes." She spread several donation reports across the table beside photographs Walter had collected. "Look here." Same names repeated over multiple years. Same people listed as receiving winter support after documented deaths. Ethan leaned closer while Sarah pointed towards several files. Hope Harbor reported federal reimbursement funds for long-term homeless outreach programs, she explained. Meaning every person still listed under active assistance increased funding. Ethan's jaw tightened. Dead people making money. Dead, poor people. Sarah corrected quietly. That matters because almost nobody checks carefully once someone homeless disappears. Duke lifted his head suddenly when Sarah spoke the word disappears. The old dog stared toward Walter's photographs beside the lamp, ears tense. Sarah noticed. "Dogs understand absence," she murmured softly. "Sometimes better than we do." Ethan watched her sort through the files with practiced focus. Why didn't anyone catch this? Sarah laughed once without humor. Because Hope Harbor became untouchable after the opioid crisis hit Wyoming. She leaned back, tiredly. Churches loved them. Politicians loved them. Rich donors loved having photographs beside homeless veterans holding blankets. Snow thickened outside while Sarah continued digging through old archived articles pulled from filing cabinets nearby. After nearly an hour, she froze suddenly while reading one newspaper clipping. "Walter tried contacting me last fall," she said quietly. Ethan looked up. Sarah removed her glasses slowly. "I thought he was confused." Shame crossed her face briefly. "He kept saying names were being reused. Said people were vanishing from shelters." She swallowed once. "One." I didn't listen hard enough. Ethan understood that tone immediately. Survivor guilt recognized itself in others like wolves recognizing scent. "You couldn't know," he said. Sarah smiled sadly. That's what people say when they want grief to sit down quietly. Duke rose slowly and walked toward the hallway unexpectedly. Ethan frowned. Duke, but the old German shepherd ignored him, nose working carefully along shelves until he stopped before a framed photograph hanging near the back room. Sarah turned and stared at it for a long moment. The photograph showed Laura Cole standing beside Sarah outside the library years earlier during a summer festival. Laura's dark hair moved freely in warm wind, while both women laughed at something beyond the camera. Ethan felt his chest tighten painfully. Sarah stepped closer to the photograph. "She used to come here every Thursday after chemotherapy," Sarah said softly. "Said libraries smelled like safe places." Ethan remained silent. The ache inside him felt old enough to have roots now. Sarah disappeared briefly into another room and returned carrying a small bundle of tied envelopes. "Laura left these with me," she said gently. Ethan stared at the letters, immediately recognizing his wife's handwriting. "Why?" Sarah's expression softened. "Because she knew you'd stop living after she died." Ethan looked away sharply. Sarah placed the letters carefully onto the table beside Walter's files. "She made me promise not to give them to you unless you disappeared completely inside yourself." Ethan's rough hands trembled slightly as he untied the bundle. The first letter opened with familiar, neat handwriting. "If you are reading this, then you are doing exactly what I worried you would do." Ethan stopped breathing for a second. Sarah quietly moved toward the stove, giving him privacy without leaving entirely. Laura's words continued gently across the page. "You survived oceans and wars, Ethan. Please do not let grief become the thing that finally buries you." Somewhere behind him, Duke rested his head against Ethan's knee silently. Ethan stared downward, while emotion moved through him with terrifying force. "She always knew," he whispered hoarsely. Sarah nodded. Laura understood lonely people because she spent her life loving one. Snow fell harder by afternoon as Ethan finally closed the letters. Something inside him had shifted slightly, though he could not yet name it. Grief remained. Guilt remained. But now Laura's voice existed beside them instead of only silence. Before leaving, Ethan asked quietly, "Can you trace where Hope Harbor moved people?" Sarah's eyes sharpened instantly again. "Already started." She handed him several copied addresses. "Most lead nowhere. Empty buildings, closed care homes, storage facilities." Ethan slipped the papers into his coat. "And Benjamin Carter?" Sarah's expression darkened. "Mayor Carter helped secure Hope Harbor's state grants. Publicly, he treats them like saints." She paused carefully. "Privately, I don't know." As evening approached, Ethan drove toward Hope Harbor's main building on the edge of town. Duke sat unusually tense beside him. The organization's headquarters looked warm and welcoming beneath golden lights and holiday decorations still hanging near the entrance. Volunteers carried food boxes through the snow, while banners promised compassion and shelter. But the moment Ethan parked, Duke's entire body stiffened violently. The old German shepherd stared toward the front entrance, with low fear rolling through him like distant thunder. Then, the doors opened. A tall man stepped outside wearing a charcoal overcoat and dark leather gloves. Richard Boone, director of Hope Harbor. Richard looked about 55, broad-shouldered with carefully combed silver-black hair and a trimmed beard that made him appear distinguished on television interviews. His smile came easily, practiced and smooth, but his pale eyes remained coldly observant, even while greeting volunteers. Duke immediately backed against the truck door, with a deep growl rising from his chest. Ethan had never heard that sound from him before. Not fear, recognition. Richard Boone glanced briefly toward the truck. For one strange second, his eyes met Duke's through the snowy darkness. And the old German shepherd recoiled as though winter itself had suddenly stepped closer. The snowstorm passed during the night, leaving Jackson Hollow wrapped beneath a brittle silence that made every sound seem farther away than it truly was. Morning sunlight spread weakly across the frozen lake behind Ethan Cole's cabin, pale as old bone beneath the clouds. Inside, warmth gathered slowly around the stone fireplace, while Duke slept near the hearth, with his grey muzzle resting on Mary Dawson's knitted blanket. The old German shepherd had begun following Mary through the cabin with quiet devotion whenever she visited, watching her movements with patient eyes that no longer carried the same desperate panic Ethan first saw beside the bridge. Sometimes grief softened, not because pain disappeared, but because another living creature finally stood close enough to share its weight. Mary moved through Ethan's kitchen now, with the comfortable confidence of someone who had spent years caring for broken people without asking permission first. She wore a thick red sweater that morning, flour dust still clinging faintly to the sleeves from the bakery. Her silver curls escaped loosely around her cheeks while she stirred oatmeal on the stove for Duke as though feeding an aging child. "He needs more meat on those bones," she muttered. Duke lifted his head immediately at her voice, tail tapping once against the floorboards. Ethan sat at the table beside stacks of Walter Hayes's documents, while Sarah Miller sorted copied files across from him. Sarah had arrived before sunrise carrying 2 boxes filled with archived county records and enough coffee to keep 3 insomniacs functioning through another Wyoming winter. Her pale face looked tired beneath the yellow kitchen light, but sharp concentration still burned behind her glasses. "I traced the transfer records," she said quietly, while flipping through folders. Most of the missing people were supposedly relocated to a long-term care facility outside Ashton, Idaho. Ethan frowned. "Supposedly?" Sarah slid several forms toward him. "The address exists. The facility barely does." Ethan examined the papers carefully. The location, Silver Pines Recovery Center, appeared repeatedly beside names Walter had circled in red ink. Yet many signatures looked identical despite belonging to different individuals. Sarah leaned back slowly. "The state stopped inspecting the building years ago after ownership changed hands." Mary carried Duke's bowl toward the fireplace while listening silently. "Meaning?" Ethan asked. Sarah's mouth tightened. "Meaning poor old men without families are easy to move around on paper." The room fell quiet except for Duke eating slowly beside the fire. Ethan stared toward the window where snow reflected weak sunlight into the cabin. "Walter figured it out," he murmured. Sarah nodded once, and Richard Boone knew he figured it out. Mary suddenly spoke from the kitchen. "You boys planning to drive into danger today?" Ethan almost smiled at the phrase "boys" coming from a 67-year-old widow. "Probably," he admitted. Mary sighed softly before setting a thermos beside him. "Then at least die with decent coffee." Duke finished eating and walked slowly toward Ethan, pressing his heavy head against the man's leg. Ethan scratched behind the dog's torn ear automatically now, the movement beginning to feel natural instead of unfamiliar. Mary noticed and smiled quietly to herself. The drive toward the old rail district happened beneath low gray skies, threatening fresh snow. Sarah followed behind Ethan's truck in her aging Subaru, while Duke sat alert beside him. The old German shepherd seemed restless all morning. Every few miles his nose lifted sharply toward the air, entering through the cracked window, as though some distant scent kept pulling at him. They stopped first at the county assistant's office, near the edge of town. The clerk there, Martha Green, looked uncomfortable the moment Ethan mentioned Hope Harbor. Martha was a narrow woman in her late 50s, with tired brown eyes and nicotine-yellowed fingers from decades of secret smoking behind government buildings. Her once dark hair had faded unevenly gray, and nervous habits lived permanently inside her hands. "I shouldn't be discussing private transfer records," she whispered while glancing repeatedly toward the hallway. Sarah placed several documents quietly onto the desk. "These people are dead, Martha." Martha's face lost color immediately. She recognized the names. Listen, she murmured shakily. I only processed forms. Hope Harbor handled transportation. Richard Boone always had signatures ready before the state even approved relocation. Ethan watched her carefully. Did anyone ever come back from Idaho? Martha hesitated too long. That alone became an answer. Outside the office, cold wind swept across the parking lot, carrying loose snow through the air like ash. Sarah leaned against her car, looking pale. Something's wrong here, she said quietly. Ethan nodded. Yeah. Duke suddenly growled low in his throat beside the truck. The sound came sharp and focused. His body stiffened toward the direction of the abandoned rail station. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. Beyond the frozen tracks stood several long storage buildings near the freight yard, mostly unused since the mining industry collapsed years earlier. Duke barked once, the first real bark Ethan had heard from him. All right, Ethan said softly. Show me. The warehouse district beyond the tracks felt dead even during daylight. Rusted chain-link fences leaned sideways beneath snowdrifts, while old railroad signs creaked in the wind. Duke moved ahead carefully, despite his age, nose low to the ground. Ethan kept pace beside him while Sarah followed, carrying her camera beneath her coat. This place gives me serial killer vibes, she muttered dryly. Ethan almost smiled, despite tension tightening his chest. Duke stopped beside a long grey warehouse near the end of the rail yard. One faded security light flickered weakly above a metal side door. The old German shepherd paced anxiously now, breathing harder. Then Ethan smelled it too, disinfectant, faint but unmistakable beneath the odors of rust and wet wood. The exact same sharp chemical scent lingering on Richard Boone's gloves outside Hope Harbor. Ethan crouched beside Duke. You remember this place, don't you? Duke's ears flattened. Sarah stepped closer, examining tire tracks half buried beneath snow. Recent, she whispered. Ethan tested the warehouse door carefully. Locked. But beside the entrance, another smaller side gate hung crooked where the latch no longer fit properly. They slipped inside quietly. Darkness swallowed them immediately, except for pale winter light leaking through cracked windows high above. The warehouse smelled abandoned, yet recently disturbed at the same time. Dust covered old shelving units, but several fresh tire marks crossed the concrete floor. Duke moved deeper into the building slowly, every muscle tense. Ethan followed while years of military instinct awakened fully now. The farther they walked, the colder the place felt. Near the back wall, Duke suddenly stopped. The old dog lowered his head beside a pile of torn blankets and growled softly. Ethan knelt beside him. Beneath the blankets rested an old denim coat stiffened by dried dark stains. Blood. Sarah inhaled sharply behind him. Ethan lifted the coat carefully. Inside the collar, faded letters spelled Walter Hayes. Duke pressed his nose desperately against the fabric before releasing one broken whine that echoed through the empty warehouse. Ethan felt rage move coldly through his chest. Not loud rage. Worse. Controlled rage. The kind that stayed patient. Sarah looked pale beneath the dim light. Walter was here, she whispered. Ethan stared around the warehouse slowly. Coup. Nearby sat an overturned wheelchair beside empty medicine bottles and cracked plastic food trays. Someone had been keeping people here, not helping them, storing them. Duke suddenly backed away from the coat with trembling legs. Ethan immediately noticed the change. Fear now, not grief. We need to go, Sarah whispered urgently. Ethan heard it too then. Somewhere outside, beyond the warehouse walls, tires crunching slowly through snow. A vehicle approaching. Ethan grabbed Walter's coat, while Duke moved immediately beside him, despite trembling. The old dog kept staring toward the dark hallway leading deeper into the building, as though terrified someone might step out from the shadows at any second. The wind returned to Jackson Hollow, carrying another hard freeze down from the Wyoming mountains. By morning, the roads looked silver beneath fresh ice, and the pine trees around Ethan Cole's cabin bent beneath the weight of wet snow. Winter no longer felt peaceful now. It felt watchful. Ethan stood near the living room window with coffee cooling untouched in his hand, while Duke slept beside the fire. The old German shepherd twitched restlessly in his dreams, paws moving faintly as if still wandering the dark warehouse near the rail yard. Since finding Walter Hayes's blood-stained coat, Duke had become quieter. Not weaker, but cautious, in a way that reminded Ethan of soldiers returning from dangerous territory. Sometimes the dog would suddenly stare toward the cabin door with his ears low, listening to sounds Ethan himself could barely hear. Fear had memory. Ethan understood that too well. Mary Dawson arrived shortly after sunrise, carrying groceries and irritation in equal measure. "Your town officially thinks you've lost your mind," she announced while stomping snow from her boots. Ethan raised one eyebrow. "Morning to you too." Mary removed her knitted gloves sharply. "I stopped at the grocery store." People suddenly got very interested in whispering. She placed canned soup onto the counter harder than necessary. "Richard Boone held some little church meeting last night." Ethan's jaw tightened immediately. Mary crossed her arms. Apparently, Hope Harbor is now the innocent victim of a traumatized ex-soldier, spreading conspiracy theories because he bonded with a stray dog. Duke lifted his head at the word stray and looked mildly offended. Even Mary smiled briefly at that. Ethan stared toward the snow outside the window. That was fast. "Men like Richard Boone survive because they move faster than shame," Mary replied quietly. She stepped closer then, lowering her voice. "Ethan, folks around here trust him. He gives speeches at funerals, pays for Christmas food drives, sponsors school jackets." Ethan nodded once. "I know." Mary studied him carefully. "Do you?" There was no accusation in her face, only worry. Ethan had spent years avoiding people because isolation felt safer than disappointment. But now, he was discovering something more dangerous than loneliness. Once a small town decided who the villain was, truth often arrived too late to matter. Later that morning, Ethan drove into town with Duke riding beside him. Snowflakes drifted lazily through pale sunlight, while Jackson Hollow moved with uncomfortable politeness around him. Conversation stopped when he entered the gas station. A pair of old men outside the hardware store watched him too carefully before looking away. At the diner, a waitress who normally smiled at Duke suddenly avoided eye contact altogether. Ethan had seen this before overseas after rumors spread through villages. Fear rarely arrived screaming. It arrived quietly, teaching people where not to stand. Duke sensed it too. The old dog stayed unusually close beside Ethan's leg as they walked through town, amber eyes moving constantly between strangers. Near the church parking lot, Ethan noticed a large banner hanging beside Hope Harbor's donation truck. "Helping the Forgotten," it read in bright blue letters. Beneath the slogan stood Richard Boone himself, speaking warmly with several residents. Richard wore a charcoal coat over a dark turtleneck, polished and composed despite the snow. He noticed Ethan almost immediately. For a brief second, the two men simply watched each other across the street. Richard smiled first. Calm, friendly, dangerous. Then he placed one reassuring hand on an elderly woman's shoulder, while continuing conversation as though Ethan no longer existed. Duke suddenly growled, low beneath his breath. Not loudly enough for others to notice, but enough for Ethan to feel the vibration through the leash. "Easy," Ethan murmured. Yet deep inside, anger tightened carefully into place. Not reckless anger, controlled anger, the kind that waited. Sarah Miller called him that afternoon, asking him to come immediately to the library cottage. When Ethan arrived, he found papers scattered across every surface, while Sarah paced near the fireplace with restless energy. Her silver blonde hair had fallen loose around her face, and dark circles rested beneath her eyes from another sleepless night spent digging through records. "Walter contacted me 3 times before he died," she said, without greeting. Ethan frowned. "You said that already." "No," Sarah answered sharply. "I mean, he literally mailed things here." She held up several old envelopes with shaking fingers. "I found them misfiled inside archived newspaper donations." Ethan took the envelopes carefully. Walter's handwriting covered each one, growing shakier from letter to letter. Sarah swallowed hard. "I never opened them because I thought he was sending rambling complaints." Shame flickered visibly across her face. Ethan opened the first envelope slowly. Inside rested copies of financial records and handwritten notes beside photographs of homeless residents. Several names had arrows drawn beside them with the words, "Moved after complaints." Another note read, "They keep using the dead because nobody asks questions about poor people." Sarah sank heavily into her chair. Walter knew months before he died. Ethan kept reading silently. The final envelope contained a short, unfinished letter addressed directly to Sarah. "If anything happens to me, ask about the warehouse beyond the tracks." Duke walked quietly across the room and rested beside Ethan's chair, as if recognizing Walter's scent on the papers. Sarah removed her glasses, rubbing tired eyes. "I should have listened." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "You couldn't know." Sarah laughed bitterly. "That excuse gets weaker every year I get older." Silence settled around them. Outside, the wind rattled bare tree branches against the library windows. Finally, Sarah spoke again, softer now. "Laura came here once after your wife got sick." Ethan's chest tightened instantly at the sound of her name. Sarah stared toward the fire. "She told me something I never forgot." Ethan waited quietly. Sarah smiled sadly. "She said loneliness scares old people more than death does." Ethan lowered his eyes. Sarah continued gently. "That's why people like Walter trusted places like Hope Harbor. When you grow old enough, kindness starts sounding like survival." That sentence stayed with Ethan the entire drive home. By evening, another storm rolled across Jackson Hollow, turning the roads nearly invisible beneath blowing snow. Mary arrived again carrying homemade stew despite Ethan insisting she should stay home in weather like this. "I spent 30 years driving through Wyoming winters," she told him firmly. "Snow and I already negotiated our relationship." Duke greeted her at the door immediately now, tail wagging slowly for the first time in days. Mary smiled warmly and rubbed his graying muzzle. "Look at you," she whispered, "acting like you finally belong somewhere." Ethan watched the scene quietly from the kitchen. Something inside the cabin had changed over the past week. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt shared. During dinner, Mary spoke more honestly than usual. "After Harold died," she said softly, referring to her husband, "I used to leave the television on all night just to hear another human voice in the house." Ethan looked up. Mary shrugged lightly, though sadness moved beneath the gesture. "Growing old alone scares people, Ethan. That's why men like Walter believed promises about care homes and warm beds." She stared down at her bowl. Nobody wants to feel disposable. Ethan glanced toward Duke, lying beside the fireplace. Walter had trusted Hope Harbor because loneliness had cornered him into hope. That thought filled Ethan with deeper anger than before. Later that night, long after Mary drove home through the storm, Ethan sat alone reading Walter's final letters while Duke slept nearby. Snow hammered softly against the cabin windows. The clock on the wall crept past midnight. Then suddenly Duke lifted his head sharply and growled. Ethan froze immediately. A second later, something slammed violently against the front door. Glass shattered. Ethan rose instinctively, just as another object struck the porch railing outside. Duke barked furiously now, deep and raw. Ethan opened the door carefully, with one hand near the old revolver kept beside the hallway. Wind exploded into the cabin, carrying snow across the floorboards. A large rock rested near the doorway, wrapped with paper and tape. Ethan unfolded the note slowly beneath the porch light while Duke stood beside him, growling into the darkness. The message contained only a single sentence written in black marker. "Stop digging, if you still want a peaceful life." Somewhere beyond the storm, tires spun briefly against icy road, before disappearing into the night. Night came down hard over Jackson Hollow, swallowing the mountains behind thick clouds, swollen with another storm. Snow drifted sideways across the frozen lake behind Ethan Cole's cabin, while wind pressed against the walls with long, hollow moans that sounded almost human in the dark. Inside, the cabin glowed faintly beneath firelight and old lamps. Duke slept near the hearth, though sleep no longer carried peace for him. Every unfamiliar sound still reached him instantly. Trauma had sharpened the old German shepherd instead of softening him. Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table rereading Walter Hayes's letters, while the threatening note remained folded beside his coffee mug like a second shadow. "Stop digging if you still want a peaceful life." The words did not frighten Ethan as much as they should have. Men had threatened him before in deserts, villages, and war zones. What unsettled him now was something different. Jackson Hollow had once felt too small for danger. Now danger walked openly through familiar streets wearing charity smiles and church coats. Duke suddenly lifted his head from the rug, not barking, listening. Ethan noticed immediately. The old dog's ears angled toward the detached garage behind the cabin where Ethan stored Walter's tin box, old military equipment, and Laura's remaining furniture that he still could not bring himself to touch. Snow rattled harder against the windows. Duke rose slowly to his feet, muscles tense beneath thinning fur. Ethan stood automatically. "What is it?" Duke growled low. Then came the smell. Smoke. Ethan moved instantly toward the back hallway, just as Duke barked sharply and lunged toward the rear door. The moment Ethan opened it, freezing wind slammed into him, carrying thick black smoke from the garage 20 yards away. Orange fire already crawled along the roofline. "Damn it!" Ethan ran through the snow while Duke charged ahead despite his age. Flames rolled violently inside the garage windows now, spreading unnaturally fast. Too fast. Ethan recognized accelerant fire immediately. Someone had poured gasoline. He kicked the side door open, and heat exploded outward like a living thing. Smoke swallowed the ceiling while flames climbed shelves of tools and storage boxes. Somewhere inside wood cracked loudly. Duke barked frantically near the back workbench where Walter's tin box remained hidden beneath loose floorboards. Ethan wrapped one arm across his mouth and pushed inside. Heat burned his eyes instantly. The garage looked unreal beneath the flames, pieces of his old life disappearing in bright orange waves. Laura's rocking chair burned beside stacked boxes of winter clothes. His old Navy equipment blackened against the walls. Yet Duke kept barking near the workbench, refusing to retreat. "Move!" Ethan shouted. The old German shepherd ignored him completely. Ethan dropped beside the floorboards, coughing hard as smoke thickened around him. His fingers found the loose panel barely visible beneath falling ash. He pulled the tin box free just as something overhead collapsed behind them in a shower of sparks. Duke barked once more, then finally backed toward the exit. Ethan grabbed the dog's collar and stumbled through the smoke, while flames roared louder behind them. The moment they burst outside, part of the garage roof gave way, with a thunderous crack. Fire exploded upward into the snowstorm, orange against endless black sky. Ethan fell heavily into the snow beside Duke, clutching the tin box against his chest while icy wind struck his smoke-covered face. For several seconds he simply lay there, breathing hard beside the old dog. Duke pressed tightly against him, trembling not from cold but from memory. The smell of burning fuel and panic must have dragged the animal back into whatever horror he had witnessed before Walter died. Ethan wrapped one arm around Duke's shoulders instinctively. "You did good," he whispered hoarsely. "You saved us." Sirens eventually echoed faintly through the storm. But before emergency trucks reached the cabin, another pair of headlights appeared first, sliding wildly along the icy driveway. Mary Dawson's station wagon fishtailed sideways before stopping near the porch. Mary climbed out immediately, wearing only a heavy coat thrown over her nightdress and snow boots half unlaced. "Ethan!" she shouted over the wind. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Mary marched through the snow toward him furiously. "Your neighbor called me after seeing smoke." She stopped abruptly upon seeing the burning garage reflected across Ethan's face. For a moment, fear softened her completely. Then she grabbed both sides of his coat with surprising strength. "Are you hurt?" Ethan shook his head slowly. Mary looked toward Duke next. The old German shepherd stood close against Ethan's leg, refusing to leave his side. Soot darkened the fur along his muzzle and chest. Mary crouched despite the snow and held Duke gently between her hands. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered brokenly. Duke leaned weakly into her touch. Behind them, flames consumed the garage entirely now, throwing violent orange light across the white storm. Snowflakes melted before reaching the fire, turning the air into clouds of steam and smoke. Ethan watched years of isolation burn apart in front of him. Strange thing was, he no longer cared about the building itself. What shook him deeply was the realization that while the garage burned, his first thought had not been about possessions. It had been about Duke, about whether the old dog made it outside alive. And after that, about Mary driving alone through a blizzard, because she feared something had happened to him. That frightened him more than the fire, because it meant loneliness was beginning to lose its grip on him. Firefighters finally arrived 20 minutes later. Among them stepped Sheriff Tom Grady, pulling his wool collar tight against the storm. Tom Grady was 61 years old, broad-chested and heavy around the middle from years behind a desk instead of patrol work. Deep creases lined his weather-beaten face, and his thick grey mustache gave him the permanent expression of a tired rancher rather than a lawman. Most of Jackson Hollow trusted him because he listened more than he spoke. But grief had hollowed something inside him too, after his younger brother died from fentanyl addiction years earlier. Since then, Tom carried quiet exhaustion behind his calm eyes, the exhaustion of a man who learned too late that good intentions often arrived after funerals. He walked toward Ethan slowly, while firefighters battled the blaze behind them. "Looks deliberate," Tom muttered, after examining the ruined garage briefly. Ethan nodded once. "Gasoline." Tom's eyes shifted toward the tin box, still clutched in Ethan's hand. "They trying to destroy something specific?" Ethan studied him carefully before answering. Maybe. Snow blew between them while emergency lights painted the trees red and blue. Finally, Tom exhaled heavily through his nose. You know, he said quietly, I've had strange feelings about Hope Harbor for a while now. Ethan remained silent. Tom looked toward the burning garage. Missing reports that disappeared. Elderly folks transferred without follow-up. Too many deaths explained too neatly. He rubbed gloved hands together against the cold. But Richard Boone's connected to half the county board. Ethan watched him carefully. So why tell me this now? Tom looked tired suddenly. Older. Because somebody just tried burning a man alive over charity paperwork. The sheriff lowered his voice further. And because Walter Hayes came into my office 3 weeks before he died. Ethan's chest tightened instantly. What did he say? Tom stared into the flames before answering. He told me people were disappearing. Silence settled heavily between them, while snow continued falling around the fire. Nearby, Mary wrapped a blanket around Duke beside the ambulance lights, speaking softly to the old dog as though comforting a frightened child. Ethan watched her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the burning garage, collapsing into itself beneath the storm. Somewhere deep inside him, grief and anger were beginning to transform into something colder, determination. The fire left behind a black skeleton where Ethan Cole's garage once stood. 3 days later, the smell of smoke still lingered across the frozen lake, like a warning that refused to disappear. Snow had covered most of the ashes by then, softening the ruin beneath white drifts. But every time Ethan stepped outside the cabin, he still saw pieces of his old life buried beneath burned beams and twisted metal. Strange thing was, he no longer felt attached to most of what the fire destroyed. The only thing that mattered now rested safely inside the cabin beneath his kitchen table. Walter Hayes's dented tin box and the old German shepherd who had saved both their lives. Duke had not left Ethan's side since the fire. The old dog followed him room to room with silent vigilance, as though terrified another disaster might arrive the moment he looked away. Even during sleep, Duke kept one eye partly open now. Trauma had deepened him instead of breaking him. Sometimes Ethan would wake before dawn and find the German shepherd sitting quietly near the front door, listening to the wind, guarding a home that had barely become his. Outside, Jackson Hollow continued pretending normal life still existed. Church bells rang on Sunday mornings. Grocery stores opened. Children climbed snowbanks near the schoolyard. But underneath the routines, something had shifted. The fire frightened people more than rumors ever could. Fires spread. Fires reached houses. Fires made even comfortable people wonder what else might be hiding beneath the town's kindness. Ethan sat beside the fireplace late that afternoon, while Sheriff Tom Grady spread documents across the kitchen table beside Sarah Miller. Mary Dawson moved quietly between them, carrying coffee and soup, refusing to let anyone investigate corruption on an empty stomach. The cabin no longer felt like a lonely refuge. It felt like a command center built by tired survivors too stubborn to quit. Sheriff Grady removed his thick coat and rubbed one weathered hand across his grey mustache while studying the papers Walter had collected. "It's all here," he muttered heavily. "God help us." Sarah pushed several files toward him. Federal donations, county reimbursements, duplicate identities. Her pale face looked exhausted beneath the lamplight, but anger sharpened her voice. Hope Harbor kept receiving support money for people already dead. Tom nodded grimly. And every time somebody questioned transfer records, Richard Boone moved them somewhere harder to track. Ethan stared into the fire quietly. Walter found out. Walter documented it, Sarah corrected softly. She lifted an old photograph from the pile. Look here. The image showed several elderly homeless men standing beside a Hope Harbor transport van. Behind them, Richard Boone smiled for the camera, while Mayor Benjamin Carter shook hands with donors. Sarah tapped two faces in the photograph. These men died weeks before this fundraiser took place. Tom exhaled slowly through his nose. Sweet Jesus. Duke lifted his head at the sheriff's voice, ears twitching slightly. Mary crouched beside the dog and stroked the silver fur along his neck. You poor old soul, she whispered. You carried all this alone. Ethan watched Duke quietly. The old dog had spent months trying to lead someone toward the truth. Walter could no longer tell himself, not because Duke understood paperwork or corruption, because love had memory. Sarah opened another folder. I tracked the Idaho facility, she said. Silver Pines Recovery Center closed 2 years ago after abuse allegations. Tom frowned deeply. Then where were these people transferred? Sarah's expression hardened. Nowhere. Most likely they died before ever arriving. Silence settled across the cabin. The fire crackled softly while snow drifted beyond the windows. Ethan imagined Walter Hayes coughing inside that warehouse near the railroad, realizing nobody intended to help him at all. Just another poor old man with no family, no lawyer, no one important enough to demand answers after he vanished. Richard Boone didn't just steal money, Ethan said quietly. He erased people. Tom nodded once, and this town helped him because he looked respectable doing it. Mary stood slowly beside Duke. Her eyes remained fixed on the photographs spread across the table. You know what the cruelest thing about getting old is? She asked softly. Nobody answered immediately. Mary folded her arms tightly against herself. One day you realize the world stops looking directly at you. People smile politely, but they stop really seeing you. Her voice trembled slightly now. That's why places like Hope Harbor become dangerous. Lonely people will trust almost anyone who promises they still matter. Ethan felt those words settle heavily inside him. He looked toward Duke lying beside the fire, and suddenly understood. Something painful. Walter had not stayed with Hope Harbor because he trusted Richard Boone. He stayed because he had nowhere else left to go. Later that evening, Sarah prepared to leave for the library cottage. But before she reached the door, she paused beside Ethan, quietly. There's something else, she said. Ethan looked up. Sarah held out another envelope, written in Laura's handwriting. I found this tucked inside the others. Ethan stared at it silently for several seconds before taking it. After Sarah and Tom finally left, the cabin grew quiet again, except for the wind outside. Mary stayed behind cleaning dishes, while Duke rested beside Ethan's chair. The old dog looked tired tonight, but not restless. Different somehow. Ethan opened Laura's final letter carefully. Her familiar handwriting moved across the page like a voice returning from another life. Ethan, if you are reading this, then you are still trying to survive grief by yourself. I wish I could tell you how unnecessary that is. Tears blurred his vision immediately. He kept reading slowly, while Mary pretended not to notice from the kitchen. One sentence stopped him completely. If one day you find a creature that needs saving, please let it save you too. Ethan lowered the letter. Something inside him finally broke open after years of being frozen shut. He covered his eyes roughly with one hand, while tears came hard and silent, not dramatic sobbing. Worse. The exhausted grief of a man who had carried loneliness too long because he believed suffering honored the dead. Mary crossed the room quietly and rested one warm hand against his shoulder. She did not speak. She understood silence too well to ruin it with comfort too quickly. Duke slowly rose from beside the fireplace and walked toward Ethan. The old German shepherd rested his heavy head across Ethan's knee, exactly the way Laura used to place her hand there during hospital nights, when neither of them knew what to say anymore. Ethan pressed trembling fingers into Duke's thick fur, while tears finally fell freely down his face. Outside, snow continued covering Jackson Hollow, beneath another Wyoming night. Somewhere beyond the mountains, the world remained cruel and indifferent. But inside the cabin, grief no longer sat alone. Hours later, after Mary had fallen asleep on the couch beneath a blanket and the fire burned low, Ethan noticed something unusual. Duke was no longer sitting beside the window, watching the road. For weeks, the old dog had listened endlessly for engines, footsteps, returning ghosts. But tonight, Duke lay stretched beside Ethan's boots near the fireplace, breathing deeply in peaceful sleep. His ears no longer twitched toward distant trucks. His eyes remained closed. For the first time since Ethan found him beside the bridge, Duke had stopped waiting for someone who would never come home. The storm finally loosened its grip on Jackson Hollow near the beginning of February. Snow still covered the streets and rooftops, but sunlight returned in brief, pale stretches across the valley, touching frozen fences and church steeples with weak silver light. The town looked peaceful again from a distance, the kind of quiet postcard place tourists imagined when they thought about Wyoming winters. But beneath the calm, Jackson Hollow had begun cracking open. Rumors no longer whispered only about Ethan Cole. Now, they whispered about Hope Harbor too. Sarah Miller's article appeared in the county newspaper on a Thursday morning beneath the headline, "The Missing Names of Jackson Hollow." By noon, half the town had already read it. Sarah sat alone inside the library cottage, while snowmelt dripped steadily from the roof outside. She looked exhausted after 3 sleepless nights spent organizing documents, interviews, photographs, and transfer records into something solid enough to survive legal threats. Her sharp, freckled face had grown pale beneath the strain, and deep shadows rested beneath her eyes. Yet there was something fierce in her expression too. Sarah had spent years regretting the moment she ignored Walter Hayes's warnings. Now, she wrote with the anger of someone trying to apologize to the dead before it became too late. Ethan arrived shortly after sunrise, carrying coffee and Duke beside him. The old German shepherd entered the cottage quietly, moving slower now, but with far more peace than before. He no longer stared endlessly toward roads and windows. Instead, he stayed close to Ethan like a guardian who had finally chosen where he belonged. Sarah handed Ethan the first printed copy of the article. "Once this spreads," she said quietly, "there's no pulling it back." Ethan studied the pages silently. Walter's photographs filled nearly half the report. Missing transfer records, dead homeless residents listed as active aid recipients, financial documents showing Hope Harbor receiving state funding long after people disappeared. And at the center of everything stood Richard Boone smiling beside donation banners and charity dinners. "You ready for this?" Sarah asked softly. Ethan looked toward Duke, lying beside the stove. Walter deserved somebody telling the truth. By afternoon, news vans from nearby counties began arriving in Jackson Hollow. The town hated attention from outsiders, especially attention involving corruption. People gathered in nervous groups outside grocery stores and churches, reading Sarah's article with pale faces and lowered voices. Some refused to believe it. Others recognized names buried inside the story. Harold Bennett, Tommy Vance, Edith Walker, people who had supposedly been relocated through Hope Harbor before quietly disappearing forever. Sheriff Tom Grady officially reopened several missing persons files that same day. The sheriff looked older than usual beneath the courthouse lights, exhaustion dragging heavily at his weathered features. But for the first time in years, determination stood behind his tired eyes instead of helplessness. "I spent too long ignoring my gut," he admitted quietly to Ethan before the county hearing began. "Not doing that again." The emergency county hearing took place inside the old municipal building overlooking Main Street. Snow still clung to the courthouse steps, while townspeople crowded shoulder to shoulder inside the hall. Ethan remained near the back, with Duke resting calmly beside him. Conversation stopped each time Duke lifted his head, as though the old German shepherd himself carried Walter's ghost into the room. Richard Boone arrived 15 minutes late, surrounded by lawyers and church board members. Even now, he looked polished and controlled, wearing a navy wool coat over a dark suit. His silver-black beard remained neatly trimmed, and his calm smile still carried the practiced warmth that once made donors trust him instantly. But today something colder hid behind his eyes. Fear. Richard spotted Ethan across the room immediately. For several seconds, neither man looked away. Then, Sheriff Grady entered, carrying several evidence boxes, while reporters lifted cameras toward the front tables. Sarah sat beside the sheriff with stacks of documents spread before her like weapons sharpened by paper instead of steel. Mayor Benjamin Carter looked physically ill sitting near the county board. The once confident mayor had aged 10 years within a week. His broad shoulders slumped beneath his grey overcoat, and his hands shook constantly as reporters circled nearby. Unlike Richard Boone, Benjamin Carter had not built Hope Harbor for money originally. That almost made the betrayal worse. He had convinced himself good intentions excused silence. The hearing lasted nearly 4 hours. Sarah presented financial records proving Hope Harbor continued, claiming aid funds for people already dead. Sheriff Grady testified regarding missing case reports and Walter Hayes's final visit before his death. Then came the warehouse photographs. The room changed after that. Silence spread through the audience like winter frost moving across glass. Several elderly residents began crying quietly after recognizing faces from the photographs. One woman collapsed into her chair, whispering her brother's name repeatedly beneath trembling hands. Richard Boone tried defending himself at first. Administrative confusion, he called it. Overwhelmed systems. But the lies grew weaker each hour as more evidence surfaced. Finally, Sarah revealed Walter's handwritten notes describing the warehouse beyond the railroad tracks and the Idaho transfers that never existed. Sheriff deputies moved toward Richard shortly afterward. The room erupted instantly. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed wildly. Richard Boone stood abruptly from his chair, fury finally breaking through his polished public mask. "You people have no idea what it costs to run programs like this," he snapped. "Nobody cared about those men until I fed them." Ethan felt Duke rise beside him immediately, muscles tense. But Richard's anger collapsed almost as quickly as it appeared. Once deputies placed handcuffs around his wrists, suddenly he looked smaller, older, not powerful anymore. Just another frightened man standing beneath fluorescent lights while truth finally reached him. As officers escorted Richard Boone outside through the falling snow, Ethan noticed something strange. Nobody stopped them. Nobody defended him. The silence felt heavier than shouting would have. Later that evening, after reporters disappeared and courthouse lights dimmed, Ethan walked slowly through Main Street with Duke beside him. Snow creaked softly beneath his boots. For the first time in weeks, townspeople approached him openly again. An elderly mechanic named Carl Benson stopped Ethan outside the diner and removed his hat awkwardly. Carl was 70 years old, with oil-stained hands permanently blackened from decades repairing engines. "I owe you an apology," he muttered gruffly. "Thought you were just another angry veteran looking for ghosts." Ethan nodded quietly. More people approached afterward. Some apologized directly. Others simply touched Duke gently, or thanked Ethan without meeting his eyes for long. Shame moved strangely through small towns. People rarely admitted guilt comfortably, but they carried it deeply once truth settled in. When Ethan finally returned home near dusk, he found Mary Dawson standing beside the burned remains of the garage, with several elderly men from town. Lumber rested in neat stacks nearby. Fresh tools leaned against trucks. Mary wore heavy gloves and an expression that tolerated no arguments. "What's this?" Ethan asked. Mary looked up casually. "Apparently your garage annoyed the neighborhood by being on fire." One of the older men chuckled quietly. Another lifted a hammer. "Figured we'd fix it before spring." Ethan stood speechless for a moment, while Duke moved between the workers, calmly accepting pats and scratches. The cabin no longer felt isolated from the town. Somehow, through grief and fire and truth, life had begun returning to it. 2 days later, Jackson Hollow held a small burial service for Walter Hayes at the cemetery beside the church. Snow covered the gravestones beneath pale morning light, while only a handful of people attended. But unlike before, Walter no longer rested in an unmarked county grave. A proper stone now stood beneath the pine trees. Walter Hayes, beloved friend. Ethan placed the old photograph of Walter beside the fresh headstone carefully. In the picture, Walter smiled beside Duke during some forgotten summer afternoon, before loneliness swallowed his life. Duke lowered himself quietly into the snow beside the grave. He did not tremble anymore. He simply rested there peacefully, while winter sunlight touched the cemetery around them, as though at last the waiting had ended. Spring arrived quietly in Jackson Hollow, not with sudden warmth but with slow forgiveness. Snow began retreating from the valley in uneven patches, revealing wet grass, broken fence posts, and stubborn wildflowers pushing through thawing earth beside the roads. The frozen lake behind Ethan Cole's cabin cracked softly during the afternoons now, long silver fractures spreading across the ice beneath pale sunlight. Water dripped steadily from the cabin roof each morning, while pine trees released heavy snow from their branches in slow, collapsing sighs. Winter had not disappeared completely yet, but it no longer ruled the town. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself opening windows instead of closing them. The burned garage behind the cabin no longer resembled a graveyard of ashes. Over the past 2 months, the people of Jackson Hollow rebuilt it board by board, beneath cold spring skies. Old men who once avoided Ethan now arrived carrying lumber, tools, and quiet apologies hidden inside rough humor. Carl Benson repaired the electrical wiring himself despite arthritic hands that shook whenever the mornings stayed too cold. Sheriff Tom Grady donated old furniture, confiscated from abandoned storage units. Sarah Miller spent weekends sorting donated books and winter blankets into shelves along the back wall. Even children from the church youth group painted fresh white trim around the windows, while Duke supervised proudly from the grass, like an aging foreman too important to work directly. Ethan stood outside the finished building one mild April morning, while sunlight reflected across wet ground around him. Above the entrance hung a wooden sign carved carefully by Carl Benson himself. Walter's Light. Beneath the words, someone had painted a small lantern beside the outline of a German shepherd. Ethan stared at the sign for a long moment without speaking. The building had become more than a repaired garage. Half workshop, half shelter, it now offered free repairs for elderly residents, hot coffee during storms, and a warm place for anyone with nowhere left to go. Old radios, broken heaters, watches, boots, and toasters filled the work tables daily. Some people arrived only for repairs. Others came because loneliness felt lighter in rooms where someone remembered their name. Duke moved slowly through Walter's Light each day, greeting visitors with calm dignity. Age had softened his body further by springtime. Grey spread deeper through his fur now, and his back legs stiffened during cold mornings. But peace had changed him too. The trembling was gone. The endless waiting beside windows had vanished. Children in town began recognizing him immediately whenever Ethan drove through Main Street. "That's Walter's dog," they would shout happily. Duke became something rare in Jackson Hollow, proof that loyalty could survive grief long enough to guide people back toward one another. One afternoon, an elderly veteran named Raymond Pike visited Walter's Light, carrying a broken clock radio beneath one arm. Raymond was 78 years old, painfully thin, with deeply sunken cheeks and tobacco-stained fingers from 50 years of smoking cheap cigarettes. His white hair remained cropped military short, despite retirement decades earlier. During Vietnam, he had lost half his hearing after a mortar explosion killed several men in his unit. Since then, he spoke softly and avoided crowded rooms because loud noises made his hands shake uncontrollably. Duke walked directly toward him the moment he entered. Raymond froze immediately. "Well," he whispered roughly. "Ain't you handsome?" Duke leaned gently against the old veteran's leg without fear. Ethan watched silently from the workbench, while Raymond scratched behind Duke's torn ear with trembling fingers. "Dog knows," Raymond murmured. "They always know." Ethan repaired the radio while Raymond drank coffee beside the open garage doors, watching spring sunlight spread across the lake. Before leaving, the old veteran quietly placed $20 beside the donation jar. Ethan pushed it back toward him. "No charge." Raymond smiled sadly. "Then keep it for the next lonely bastard who walks in here." By May, Walter's Light had become part of the town itself. Churchwomen delivered soup twice a week. Teenagers helped stack firewood behind the building. Travelers occasionally stopped after hearing about the strange old Navy SEAL and his famous German Shepherd near the lake. Some nights Ethan would stand outside watching warm yellow light spill through the garage windows onto the grass, while people laughed softly inside over coffee and card games. The loneliness that once filled the property had retreated so gradually, Ethan barely noticed it leaving. Mary Dawson officially moved into the cabin near the end of spring. Neither she nor Ethan ever announced it directly. One day her clothes simply appeared folded inside the bedroom drawers. Her books rested beside Laura's old shelves, and her tea kettle whistled softly in Ethan's kitchen every morning before sunrise. Love at their age no longer needed grand declarations. It arrived quietly through routine. Through someone remembering how you liked your coffee. Through an extra blanket placed nearby before storms arrived. Through another heartbeat existing calmly inside the same house after years spent alone. Mary planted flowers beside the porch once the ground thawed fully. Duke followed her constantly while she worked, occasionally collapsing dramatically into the grass whenever she spent too long pulling weeds. "You're lazy," Mary informed him regularly. Duke responded by thumping his tail once, without shame. Each morning, Ethan and Mary sat together on the porch drinking coffee, while Duke wandered slowly through the wet grass beside the lake. Some mornings they barely spoke at all. The silence between them no longer carried emptiness. It carried rest. Sarah Miller published her book in early June. The Forgotten Names of Jackson Hollow became unexpectedly successful across Wyoming and neighboring states. The book told Walter Hayes' story alongside the stories of dozens of elderly homeless people erased quietly through systems designed to protect reputations instead of lives. Sarah dedicated the first page simply, "For the people nobody looked at long enough." During the small book launch held inside the old library, Sarah stood nervously before the crowd, holding the first printed copy. "This was never supposed to become a book," she admitted softly. "It was supposed to become an apology." Afterward, she handed the first signed copy to Ethan. Inside, she had written, "Laura was right. You only needed something to save." Summer finally began touching Jackson Hollow by late June. The lake behind the cabin reflected gold beneath longer evenings, while crickets replaced winter winds after dark. One quiet night, Ethan sat alone beside the fireplace inside the cabin, while Duke slept nearby. The old German Shepherd lay stretched across the rug with slow, peaceful breathing, one grey paw twitching faintly in dreams. Mary slept down the hallway with her lamp still glowing softly through the cracked bedroom door. Outside, warm rain moved gently through the trees around the lake. Ethan looked at Duke for a very long time. Months earlier, he had found that exhausted animal standing beside a frozen bridge, waiting faithfully for someone who would never return. Back then, both of them had been stranded inside grief, too stubborn to release. Now the cabin glowed with warm yellow light again. Laughter returned to its walls. Life moved through it softly, instead of silence. Ethan leaned back in his chair, while firelight flickered across Duke's sleeping fur. And for the first time in many years, he finally understood something Laura had known all along. Sometimes God did not send miracles wearing wings or speaking from heaven. Sometimes he sent them old, tired and shivering beneath falling snow. Sometimes miracles arrived in the shape of a faithful dog standing alone beside a forgotten road, patiently leading lonely hearts back toward the light waiting for them at home. Sometimes God does not change our lives through great storms or loud miracles. Sometimes he sends a quiet miracle, standing alone in the cold, waiting patiently for someone broken enough to finally notice it. Walter Hayes believed he had been forgotten by the world. Yet even after his death, the love between an old man and his loyal dog became the light that saved other lonely souls. Ethan thought grief had buried the best part of him forever. But God used a tired old German shepherd to guide him back toward kindness, friendship, and life itself. In our everyday lives, many people around us are carrying silent pain that nobody sees. A kind word, a warm meal, a simple act of compassion can become the miracle that keeps another human being going one more day. Never believe that small goodness means nothing, because sometimes heaven works through the smallest hands, the quietest hearts, and the most forgotten creatures. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope tonight. Leave a comment about where you are watching from and what part of the story moved you most, and subscribe to the channel so more people can discover stories about faith, healing, love, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your family, bring peace to your home, and remind you that even during the coldest winters of life, no faithful heart is ever truly alone.